So to kick off, I'm delighted to introduce our first panel, which is looking ahead industry viewpoints on the next 2 years. We have Ant Morse, who is the head of digital at Telefonica O2, Lucy Sinclair, the director of market insights at Google, and Jason Kitcat, who is the director of digital data and technology at the Department of International Trade. So thank you all for joining. Great to have you with us. So before we kick off, I'd love to just quickly do some whiz round introductions. Jason, if I could just start with you to kick us off.
Sure, yeah. So as you said, I'm Director for Digital Data and Technology at the Department for International Trade. DDAT, as we call ourselves, is about 300 people. And my background, I've done technology and public policy in public sector, private sector, third sector, and I'm also a recovering politician as I was leader of the council in Brighton some years ago. But I take the pill daily and now I'm no longer a politician.
Lucy, would you like to go next?
Great morning, everyone. I'm Lucy. I direct the market insights team at Google for the EMEA region, so Europe, Middle East and Africa. I've been there about 18 months. And we spend our time looking at consumer trends and consumer insight, both to support our own internal marketing teams with our business strategy, but also our customers and customers at Google Ads side with insights for them. And my background, way back when I was at the BBC, I launched BBC iPlayer, then I went into publishing for a few years, my sins, and then I had a quirky 3 years running digital transformation at the Royal Opera House in London, turning them into an e-commerce tourism venue rather than just a theatre for Google.
Thanks, Lucy. And Ant, over to you as well.
Yes, hi everyone. I'm Ant Morse. I'm the head of digital solutions at Telefonica O2, supporting the enterprise and our global M&C business. My background is telecommunications and digital services, so some 26 years in the industry, going back to the original days of Cellnet, with focus on a range of technologies, including IoT, DWP solutions, big data, and now into AI and kind of future of artificial intelligence, augmented reality and virtual reality as well.
Amazing. Well, thank you all so much for joining. Really good to have you with us. So to kick off, obviously 2020 was a big year. We saw a lot of change for all industries. So what fundamental changes did we see emerge across that year? Lucy, if I could come to you first.
Sure. So I think obviously the biggest shift, which everybody knows, was the shift to digital and the internet, 60% growth of internet use worldwide. And there's been some great stats, 10 years growth in 10 months in America, 5 years growth in 10 months in the UK, which everybody knows. I think the big shifts we saw, so e-commerce obviously in the UK went up about 6%, varies depending on the sources. We saw a big shift of kind of the blurring of online to offline. So they've been functioning quite separately. What we've seen is that consumers are merging their online and offline behaviors. So I'll give you an example. Searches for online absolutely rocketed when we look at the search data trends. Searches for near me completely collapsed at the beginning of the pandemic. So one was up here, one was down here. When we got to about June or July, they kind of converged at a higher level than they were before. And then they've stayed like sort of together. So we think that's one of the big shifts that is going to stick, is that the kind of explosion in consumer touch points and the blurring of what's digital and what's real, what's physical, is going to be a big one. And then I would say the other big shift, which feels a bit obvious, but we've seen it, is kind of the acceleration of everything. So in the way that digital, as you all know, generally makes things a bit faster, that dramatic shift as everybody learned new habits, it was like a mass experiment, wasn't it, in people discovering what online and digital can do. We think it's going to stay, that everything is going to be faster. So being, understanding change and change happening more quickly, we think would be one of the trends that definitely stays around.
And I think we'll come on to that idea a little later on as to what is actually here to stay. But Ant, if I could come to you, what is the impact that you've seen in terms of your industry in regards to what Lucy was just sharing there, with that blurring between the online and the offline?
Yeah, absolutely. I think obviously we played a key role in keeping people connected throughout the pandemic, and our network saw a huge shift as people went to work from home. So they were, we built a network and capacity where we expected people to be, and suddenly all of that changed. I think the good news is that, we as users of technology, the tools were there, we were able to cope. And I think the interesting is, they say the explosion and growth of these products is phenomenal, but actually they were already there. Lots of the technology to keep us working was in place. I think it's probably safe to say this wasn't in many people's disaster recovery manual. I don't think we had pandemic on the forecast anywhere in the plans. But the tech was there. We managed to keep working. I think there were some swan-like effects where, there was it seemed to work, but there was lots of backpedaling and an activity behind the scenes, making sure that people had devices out in field. But yeah, I think it was a really positive for the majority of organisations we've spoken to, and as I say, we felt that from our big data insights as well, working with government, understanding where people were, where the demand was going to be for those services, and ultimately where their people were as well.
Oh, thank you. And Jason, from your perspective, I guess what is your response to that point?
Yeah, so I think there are two sort of strands to that. I'd say internally for our staff, we very rapidly adopted MS Teams, and that acted as sort of a great leveler, because DIT is the second largest employer of civil servants overseas after the Foreign Office. But they previously had used, let's say, a hodgepodge of systems, and suddenly everyone, no matter where they were in the world, was on a single system and able to communicate. So I think that's had quite a sort of interesting impact on culture and practice. And then if you connect that with Places for Growth, which is the policy where more civil servants are going to be based outside of Whitehall, there's some interesting culture change around it doesn't really matter where you are. And, I'm sure there's a lot of tech companies who've been on that journey, but Whitehall is still the centre of power and government. And so this is quite a shift culturally for us. The fact that we're able to roll that out quickly and smoothly was, great for everyone who needed it in a rush, but also showed that sort of modern ways of technology working, being cloud first, and all of that was paying dividends. So that was a sort of great assurance in our strategy. From the public perspective, 2020 had a number of moving parts for us, because obviously there was the pandemic, but there was also exiting the EU, the new trading environment, all of that. And we saw a huge demand on the services that we provide on gov.uk and so on, about how do they prepare for that, what are the new rules going to be. And so the products that we built, like Check How to Export Goods and so on, were under pressure. And so it was quite a, no one could plan for this convergence of issues, but I think by having done the hard work a few years back in terms of the sort of infrastructure, we were able to flex and cope, and that put us in a good stead.
Definitely. So I think moving on to then thinking about the impacts that you've all shared, kind of different changes that we've seen over the last year or so. How will these changes impact the business landscape long term? And obviously there are different manifestations of that for different industries. Lucy, you talked about the explosion of consumer touch points. So I guess, Ant, I'll come to you first. Do you have thoughts on that question?
I do, yes. And I think the long-term changes are the bit that we really need to get right. So I think, let's go back. So pandemic lands, we went into that kind of, panic mode, and then it was about bolstering the defences, making sure it all worked. And as I summarised, we kind of got through, most organisations did manage to keep running. What's going to happen next, in my opinion, is we're going to see a significant change now in how people want to work and how they want to be serviced and as a consumer as well. So we're now at a point where we're planning the future of work, and that seems to be a hot topic for many. What does the office look like? What does the remote model look like? How do we manage people in a virtual environment? But actually, there's another aspect that businesses need to plan for, and that's as we change as employees, actually our requirements and expectations on organisation change as well. We see patterns emerging where people want to talk less. They're happy to be self-serve in far more instances as well. They want to use their time more efficiently. So I think as we've seen this societal change on the back of the pandemic, as people will work differently. They'll work different hours. They'll potentially, 4-day week, 6-hour days. All of these things are coming in. They're going to make better use of their personal time, and that will include in how they want to buy goods, how they want to interact with providers as well. So I think that's one of the impacts we're going to see, especially for organisations with a large consumer focus.
Definitely. And I guess, Lucy, if I could come to you next on that point, what is the impact that you think will kind of affect the business landscape long term in terms of these explosion of consumer touch points?
We don't have the answer yet. I think it's a thing that my team are looking at a lot at the moment. We published a study sort of middle of last year around what we called the messy middle, which is kind of mid-funnel, where when people are evaluating their options versus when people are kind of exploring and narrowing down their options, how that it's not really a funnel anymore. It could look like a messy space of all these touch points, but it's actually two quite distinct mental models, one when you're opening up and one when you're closing down. So the implication, especially for marketers actually and CMOs, of how do you show up across all of those spaces consistently is quite a different model from, perhaps 2 years ago, of where you might have a brand marketing strategy that was a bit separate to your performance or sales activation strategy. So definitely bringing those two together. And then the other one is, I think, because we see faster fluctuations and continual change as probably a sustaining trend. Like, I don't think we're just going to settle down and go back to how things were before. We're pretty certain that sort of change and pivoting away from brands, choices, both more complex but also easier. You're only one click away from changing your brand and disrupting loyalty and stuff. Being more insights driven around your customer, so really getting real-time live customer data about what they're interacting with and where. We think that's absolutely killer. So Google, my product counterparts, launched a new insights page, for example, during the pandemic as a direct response to customers saying, look, we need to understand what's going on in real time with our customers. So I think getting your data into a place where you can actually see what's happening with your business is utterly critical and really quite fundamental for a lot of businesses who haven't already gone on that journey. Others who have gone on that journey, we've seen quite a lot of customers, and to some extent, surprisingly, some of our teams, where the data's there, but people aren't systematically using it. So there's a shift. I think you had a session this morning. There's a shift from just having data isn't enough. It's actually understanding it and drawing insights from it and acting on it. So those are two really critical things, I think, for businesses. I'll stop there for now. I could talk for hours on this topic, but.
Yeah, I'd second that as well, Lucy. I think it's a really important point, and I think you probably articulated beautifully what I was one of the points I was looking to make as well, which is around that. How do we actually use the data? So having it, harnessing it, and then using tools to actually utilize it better. There was a survey recently that suggested that 32% of people are actually really happy to share a further degree of data as long as it's useful for them. And the point around self-serve, actually, if 3 of the security checks could be done just by my voice or just by biometrics on my phone, when I get through, and then actually them knowing me, remembering me, expecting me as well, and saying, well, the last 2 calls were about this topic. It looks like it was resolved, but it could be this. So I think you're absolutely right. I absolutely agree.
Yeah, and actually one of the big things that we saw coming out of our annual research at the beginning of this year was the #1 digital initiative for businesses in the next 6 to 12 months was getting more value out of data. So I think completely it's absolutely kind of dominating all industries, really. It was quite a unanimous result. But Jason, I don't know if you've got thoughts on this area.
Yeah, so I think, touching what others say, I think the social contract of work has fundamentally changed. I think what people expect from employer and what they expect from work has been significantly altered, and I don't think that's going back. What I mean by that is that things that were perks before, let's say, free breakfast in the office or something like that, are not really so compelling now. The idea of having to commute 5 days a week into a location just to be seen is not so compelling. Good collaboration space, opportunities to come together, but for valuable time rather than rote meetings. I think all of those things are going to change in people's expectations and how managers behave. And that's going to be, people have been in an exceptional time, and this has been not working from home, but surviving in a pandemic at home while working and juggling childcare and all those things. So what the new normal is, I think we're going to learn by doing, but it will change the competitive space for employers and recruitment, I think, quite a lot. I also think from my perspective, quite a lot of what's happened in the last year has sort of cemented the case that owning core parts of your digital products and being able to have the ability to flex on them because you own that stack is really strategically important. And of course, very few organizations need to own and build everything from top to bottom. I'm not suggesting we all build our own spreadsheets or anything, but key parts of the DIT product stack were things that we build and own internally. And so we've been able to respond quite quickly to changing circumstances where we wouldn't if they were outsourced. And I think that for a lot of governments around the world has been quite a light bulb moment. So, maximizing some of the platforms they've got from, Google and Amazon and so on, but also owning some bits. I think you're going to see much more investment in recruiting and retaining in-house capability for that across the public sector. And I just think the last thing, how in parks people wear a sort of space in the grass where the path should have been, but it wasn't, and it's the most convenient way to go. I think those are sort of shifting across the whole landscape, and we sort of need to watch where the new wear marks are going to be. And just the example I can think of locally is where I am in Tunbridge Wells, horror of horrors, John Lewis is shut. And there is no more John Lewis in Tunbridge Wells, but there are a number of petrol stations with a little Waitrose in where people can get John Lewis stuff delivered. How is that changing the nature of how people move around in this small town and where they pop in on the way to and from? Because the John Lewis was out of town. And I think a whole bunch of behaviours are going to shift and adapt. And what that means is a lot of unintended consequences. It's really interesting just to stand back and watch where is the grass being worn away and how do people respond to that.
I think that's a really interesting point, Jason. Thank you for sharing that. And if we look forward then to the next 2 years, obviously we've kind of discussed different changes and how we can look for those signs like you've been sharing, Jason, those wear marks as to where the path is going next. How can businesses make sure that they are focused on those changes now? We've touched on it a little bit, I think, with that harnessing that data. But Lucy, in terms of sustaining those changes across the 2 years, I think there's a whole variety happening there, employee, consumer, market changes. But how can businesses make sure they're focused on those to stay afloat in 2021?
So I think, again, it's a huge topic. I think one of the key things is it does vary by business and it varies by sector. One of the challenges we've had on my team is like when you try and generalize these things, they become super bland quite quickly. Whereas at a granular level of my business or my customers or my industry, it can be quite a different answer. So retail is a really interesting one. You mentioned John Lewis. At the highest level, we've seen things like searches for delivery near me peaked like 177% up in the UK in the middle of the pandemic, and they're still 66% up, and they were declining before. So things like that for that particular businesses that can do delivery clearly impacted in quite a different way to businesses that totally can't, where actually what's happening in those businesses is people are looking online, not for the products or delivery, but for when the opening hours are. But then in that first sector, those opening hours is declining. So I feel like I'm not hedging the question slightly because it's very hard to give a generic answer that covers all of it. I think the main thing, I'm just going to come back to the data point and the insight point and the availability of data in a way that your staff can use, I think, is the killer thing. So pushing the right data to the front line of your staff so that they have access to it. So like almost the final death knell of the digital department who were hoarding data and information to themselves. And certainly, I run an insights department. There's utterly no way we can do all the insight for everybody. So a lot of our remit is to try and find ways and sustainable ways whereby that kind of real-time insight is available to frontline people. So I think for businesses and execs, whatever business you're in, thinking about that, who needs access to your data, obviously in a way that's privacy safe for your consumers that you're gathering, but who needs access and how can they get it? To give you an example, when we talked about the touch points, the CMO traditionally might be just thinking about the advertising channels. Whereas actually increasingly your logistics operation and your lorries and the experience of those is every bit as important and as big a part of your brand experience as it was before. So how do you even budget in that way? So I think there's a big moment for executive teams to come together and really think about how they're working and who has access to what. And then it gets really granular in your own industry.
Definitely. I think you're kind of, sorry, Ant, you look like you're about to dive in there.
Oh, no, I think just absolutely expand on that. I think for me, it's about having the agility. We're out of lockdown, things are improving, and I think it's easy to, kind of focus on what the model of returning to work looks like, what we do with the sites and everything else. But I think the change is still significant, and I think there's more to come. And it goes back to a few points that Jason and Lucy have mentioned there. One is, if you think about the people, we've got to get the model right to bring our people back to work. And I say back to work, not to the office. There's varying different stats. I think 32% say they never want to see an office again. 28% say they have to be in an office. So we've got to build the right model for our people, allowing for that options and variance and hybrid mode. We've got to manage them in a different way, and we've got to get that right. Otherwise, we have a problem with talent. We have a problem with job retention, and Jason mentioned job competition. This is going to be ever more present. People are making, family changes and decisions. Society is evolving on the back of the output of the pandemic. Families are going to decide what the future of work looks like for them, not this is the industry I'm in, these are the jobs available, I must go for it. Actually, this is an opportunity for people to think differently. Gig economy workers will make choices and make different things. So we've got to get it right for the people. And then, to my earlier point, we've got to remember that those people are also our customers. So we've got to make sure we've got the ability to evolve the model for them. There is no way the majority of industries will remain intact. There will be some change, whether it be slight or whether it be significant, that they'll have to evolve to. And Lucy mentioned, the growth, 2 months in 2 years growth in 2 months, and we've accelerated to a point in the digital transformation and digital revolution now that is going to be very, very disruptive. And I think the best example to give here is it's going to be a bit like retail. We're going to see some of the things changing, whether that's jobs advertising, the hours that are different, or I saw one the other day that was remote head of whatever department, and it was quite clear it was remote. The expectations were very clear and very precise as to what that job was going to look like. So it's important that we are ready to build those models, but also then ready to understand how we change our business. It's like with retail, the signs are going to be there. It may take longer. There won't be this big bang of the pandemic, the lockdown happened and everyone went home. But if we don't adjust our model, but for both customer and employee, we'll start to lose rent. There'll be winners and losers on the back of this. I'm absolutely certain of it. And I think the bit that's missing, or the bit now as I work with a number of CIOs week in, week out. The bit now is having the agile model of review, the chance to be able to say, well, what if this happens? What if that happens? Because there's no certainty. We don't even know quite what the next stage of the pandemic is going to look like, really. If we look across the globe, it's a moving feast. We can't be complacent, but we need to have that, review of the office, review of the services, but keep it dynamic, agile, and flexible to continue to watch it. Otherwise, as I say, I think there will be clear and again, like with the retail example, there'll be clear winners and losers in this. Very capable organizations will miss some of the signs or not have the business model to be able to adjust.
Mm-hmm. And I think some of what you've shared there, Ant, links back to Jason, what you said previously about that leveler that you saw when we kind of moved into the pandemic. So how do you think that's going to pan out with, I guess, in response to what Ant's been sharing?
So I think, and I think see Mike in the comments said it was remote work's never been a problem for them, but for their manager it has been. And I think, if you get to a certain point in your career and it's been done through eyeballing people in the office and chairing board meetings in person, remote is quite threatening to your way of operating. So I think we will see certain sort of cohort of managers struggling with this, and that will have impacts on where the talent chooses to go. And I think there are sort of reflections we all need to take about how we manage, and if we manage by whether people are present or about the outputs. And I think personally, I don't really care where someone is or what hours they work. It's the work is being done is the main thing, and that they are, healthy and feeling good about themselves. And that should be my priority as their leader. But obviously, that hasn't always been the traditional way of leading. Just on the point around data and so on, I think, data is hugely important, and collecting it is pointless if you're not doing something with it. And we in DIT have built our own in-house product called Data Workspace, where anyone can get any of over 100 data sets and analyze it and use it to that end. Because as Lucy said, you can have the best insight team in the world, and I've got great data scientists, but there just aren't enough of them to do everything for everybody. But I would just say that data is only ever one part of the picture, and you need that qualitative insight as well. Just to give an example, survey data in January, February of this year about export and import. And obviously, as you know, the border had some changes, and so we were very keen to see what was going on. The survey data we got back from things like the sort of Freight Association and so on was like, why are you exporting not as much as you did last month? And they were saying, well, because it's COVID, because of changes in the rules, because of this, that, and the other. And they ticked every box. So it didn't actually help us very much. They just, and so we had to get the qualitative data and go and talk to actual, logistics people, exporters, and so on, and sort of colour in the picture a bit more with that qualitative data. So don't underestimate the value of user researchers, service design, and those kind of professions, I would say, because that is definitely a part of understanding the richer picture. And sometimes, surveys can be misleading, right? As we know.
That's Jason, that's the thing. I so agree with that. One of the changes we're actually driving internally, and again, it's it's a tech company, is to try and automate as much of the basic data and basic data collecting and automate the service and so on, so that we can put the human intelligence and the human manpower into things like service design or interpretation or insight or, following it through. And I think we would advise customers the same. It's a mistake people make, is that you just build a dashboard and you've done your data solution. It's so not that. You need people sitting, looking at it, understanding it. But obviously no business can afford to do it. So automation solutions to get the data in the first place, that's the bit we're automating in order to protect the actual people and the manpower and the thinking elements. Definitely need the qual as well as the data.
I totally agree. I mean, I do think there's some fair points in the chat there about, not everyone's going to be remote, sitting, looking at dashboards and stuff, and that's true. And I think one of the concerns we're exploring at the moment is for new starters, where the civil service is their first job, how do they learn and watch? And, maybe they need to be in the office more. And yeah, this is all learning by doing, right? It's a new space for all of us.
There's actually a question that's just come into the chat, which I'd like to pull into the discussion now, from Jack Fitzgerald. So Jack, thank you for sending this in. He says, how much of this is an opportunity to manage people based on the individual's needs and preferred environments? Some people need people to bounce ideas off, some need space to think, some need a bit of both. How can we focus on both outputs and also shaping the office and organization accordingly? I don't know if people have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I got. It's a very good question, and we ran a piece of research recently that looked at people's preferences of how they wanted to work, because the stats are suggesting that 86% want to work flexibly. As I say, 32% don't want to see an office again. 28% must have an office. I think building that hybrid model and then evolving our management tools is essential. We're already kind of planning our return. We, like many of the comments here, have we've been working flexibly for many years. Remote working is not new to the majority of us, but actually now we're missing that interaction. I think Jack mentioned the ideas to bounce people to bounce ideas off. Absolutely, we collaborate well online and needs must, and we've done a number of virtual workshops and those types of things, and the tools there are wonderful. But actually, there isn't, for me, there's no substitute in getting in a room, sharing a coffee and really delving into those things. So I think for me, it's around getting the balance right of understanding the people, how they want to be managed, how they want to work, and then having the options. Now, we've got to do it sensibly. We can't do it all. We can't provide, home working for everyone and still have lots of sites as well. But it's around finding the right balance of the two, and then giving people an option. And one of the key ways to do it is to build personas. So to actually understand what the workforce looks like and what equipment, what working environment. And then as to that example I made earlier, is then clearly advertising it, clearly declaring that this is the role, this is the expectations, this is what we provide to you. And I think that's what we're starting to see now. Just as I say, just looking around LinkedIn, you see people hiring, and as mentioned, it's a remote only, and then people giving really clear expectations. But yeah, I think early into pandemic, it was this we loved the work-life balance and the time with the family, and it was great. But I think, the reality is far from that. I think we'll still embrace that, but it will be balanced now with the need to be together, to collaborate, to socialize, from everything from getting stuff done, but also just down to general well-being. We need to keep in touch.
Definitely. I think there's an interesting point. There are lots of interesting points coming through on the chat. So thank you everyone for getting involved there. But I'd like to just pull out something that Rob Clifford has said. I'd like to observe that there is an emerging requirement here to really consider how to start systematically deploying corporate knowledge capture tools, which I think is a really interesting point. So if we use that as a bit of a pivot towards digital strategy, where should that be going in the next 6 months, 12 months, 24 months? Jason, if I could come to you first, what are the priorities?
Well, I mean, it's very hard to predict, and I think you have to be a fool to make any hard predictions. But from my perspective and where we're at, the focus for our department is on free trade negotiations. So 63% of all UK trade is currently covered by agreements. We want to get to 80%. And we had to pivot very quickly in March of last year to completely virtual free trade negotiations. Just to give you context, historically a free trade negotiation would involve a group of 30 to 50 people going out to the other country, being in conference centres and hotels for a period of weeks before coming back. That hasn't been possible. And actually what the trade negotiations all found is actually they get a lot more done through the virtual stuff, and then when they do have an actual meeting, and they're much rarer and in smaller numbers, they're really productive because a lot of the faff has been dealt with. So we think that's probably going to be the nature that we've changed. The nature of free trade negotiation has changed forever, essentially because of this. But that brings technological complexities. Every country's government has different security requirements and technologies for video conferencing and what they're allowed to use and so on. It's not as simple as sharing a Zoom link. So that has put some burdens on us in terms of technology and staffing. So that's one of the things looking forward. In terms of other things, for us, it's building more products that we own to support UK exporters. So, for example, we have a website called great.gov.uk where essentially it's a place where businesses can go to find opportunities overseas, and also where overseas businesses can find opportunities to invest in the UK. We're putting a lot more investment in that moving forward, using some data science techniques to help businesses more effectively find their future export opportunities. We think that will be the future. There'll be less sort of in-person type activity in that space, and it'll be more digital first. But that's a guess, right? We think that's where it will go. We shall see. We've got lots of data analytics built into it to see what the direction of travel is. But who knows? I mean, I also think there's a lot of change going on around sort of privacy regulation, security regulation. The SolarWinds stuff and all those things are changing people's threat model, and it is worth noting that crime has significantly moved online through the pandemic, not just e-commerce, right? Everyone's moved online, and so I think we all are being more mindful in how we manage our staff and our security posture, and that's something that we all need to be mindful moving forward, and something that perhaps is a bit less of a Cinderella service. We saw, for example, Hackney Council taken seriously offline by a cyber attack in the last year. This is real, it can happen, and so people are going to have to put more priority in this kind of stuff.
Lucy and Ant, I don't know if you have any thoughts around digital imperatives for the next year, building on what Jason has shared there.
I've got a slightly left field one, which is
go for it.
It links to what we've been talking about earlier. Maybe it's not that left field, and it links to some of the comments as well, which is I think the biggest skill and the biggest thing for either digital departments or businesses to think about with digital is around leadership and how change is led and how people are managed. Because if you look at all those themes that have come through, treating your internal staff as your customers, trying to drive change, there was a question there about business processes. All of these things, they're not really digital things, they're sort of business things. And the fact that we've got new models of working and a more competitive work environment coupled with a more insecure work environment means the art of like leadership and managing, for me, I think it actually all comes from there. And so putting serious focus on getting the right leaders who can unlock the experts to give the right outcomes versus maybe saying, 10, 15 years ago, where it was the expert knowledge, somebody put in the comments, I think it was Andrew put in the comments, the people who had all the knowledge, the digital gurus and stuff. I think it's not that anymore. I think you need those experts. Of course you do. You need data scientists and engineers and digital people, but it's actually about company leadership and how you unlock that as a whole company together that I think will be the make or break really for the digital strategy, actually.
I think from my perspective, I think everything Jason and Lucy have covered there, and I think the point that a couple of people referenced in the chat was around skills and insight and knowledge, and I think there was the word Andrew used, learning organization. I think this is really key. If you think about my team just as an example, there isn't a school subject or university course that covers what they do. Some of those people are experts in field, advising government on a weekly basis as to how to progress certain services. That knowledge and skill is what we need to embrace now, and that learning culture is critical. Particularly as, again, I mentioned earlier, we're going to see a far faster acceleration now of digital adoption. This has kick-started the next stage. This for us is going to be a historic transformation in our phase of the wider industrial revolution. Not to focus on those skills will be an oversight for many. I think the management piece, absolutely agree. That I think will be dealt with quite quickly. Those that are not managing, and I mentioned this previously about presenteeism versus output, I think we'll quickly see that start to divide, and there'll be winners and losers on the back of it. The next stage is with the talent you've got, then how do you really build on that? How do you learn the new services and systems? We talked about data earlier. What do we do with it? How many data scientists have we got? Do we need data scientists as well? Actually, is there a middle ground where we've got some incredibly capable people in our organizations who could understand and do a huge amount with this data, but who's providing the skill sets to them? Then what do we do about AI, the fastest growing technology there is, and it self-propels, but are we ready for that? Have we got the knowledge? And again, it's not necessarily about going out and hiring the skills. It's how can we evolve our existing workforce, working in different ways, learning in different ways, I think is absolutely key. I think Andrew and Rob mentioned it. It's a number one priority. It should be.
Absolutely. Well, we are close to running out of time. I think we've covered a lot of points there. I don't know if anyone has any closing thoughts in terms of what the kind of key messages that we should be taking as digital leaders into the next year.
Yeah, I think for me, it's happened. We've got by. We've coped very well. There will be winners and losers moving forward. It's far from over, is my assessment of it. I think it's about being agile in our change. And breaking the model. We proved, I think the average timescale to deploy a new service is in most organizations is around 320 days. Forgive me, I don't know where that stat came from, but it stuck. We mobilized thousands of people in what would have taken years and years of assessment. Most organizations did it within a week. Some did it overnight. It proves the agility is there. We need to keep that in mind and use the pandemic as a lesson and as a continuous reminder moving forward that the unexpected is to be expected, and actually having that can-do culture, that agile attitude to be able to embrace the next stage. Because as mentioned, we've discussed so many here, there will be opportunities and there'll be further disruptions, and it's about building the organization that is capable and able more than anything else to embrace it, and not just to be a victim that made it through, but actually to seek the opportunities and grow.
Jason, Lucy and Ant, thank you all so much for joining us.